Welcome back to Light the Fuse, the Mission Impossible podcast that just won't quit as much as you want us to. Sorry.
Do people want us to quit?
Yeah, I think so. I think we're a menace. I think there's going to be a public outcry to shut this podcast down, but we're not going to do it, you know?
Wow. I hadn't heard that. That's good for me to know.
Yeah. Well, you've heard about the legal rumblings, right? Against Kevin. So I wonder if that's just going to take us all down.
We're always actively encouraging legal ramifications for Kevin Blue. Yeah, legal action for sure, yes.
No, people are enjoying the show. I think we're actually more popular than we've ever been right now. So I think that means that 10 to 12 people are listening every week, which I think is great. I mean, those numbers are great. They're great.
No, it's more than that.
Okay, good.
Before we talk about Joe Kraemer today, we've had so many things come up in the last few weeks. We haven't been able to talk about this, but I wanted to bring up Brian Depalma on Alec Baldwin's podcast. A lot of people sent it to us to listen to, and we've listened to, and I wanted to discuss this because it's pretty fun. Depalma tells the whole story of making Mission Impossible, and there were just some fascinating little tidbits here. He said that Sidney Pollack wanted out of Mission Impossible so he could make the Sabrina remake, which was not the best choice.
Well, it's a bad movie, is what it is.
But actually, I don't know if I've ever seen it all the way through. I love the original, the Billy Wilder Sabrina. I don't know if I've actually seen the remake, so I probably shouldn't shit on it too much. But by most accounts, I don't think it's thought of very highly.
It's not, no. But, it worked out for the best.
Yes. I mean, I'm still fascinated by what the Sidney Pollack Mission Impossible would have looked like, but I am, beyond thrilled to have Brian De Palma's Mission masterpiece in our eyes. He said that Tom wasn't liking what the first two screenwriters were doing, so De Palma kicked them out. I assume that's a reference to, what was it? It was Katz and Huyck. I forget how to pronounce their names, but they wrote Temple of Doom. Is that who he's referring to, you think?
I guess so. I mean, I know that there were other writers that were involved with the script too at various points, but I guess that they were the only ones that that there was a full-on screenplay being worked on before De Palma was involved. So I would love to read that script.
Yes, me too. That was the one that I think had the original members of the TV show getting killed off, maybe. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that does sound right. We got to get that script.
Yeah, we do. Then he said that he got together with Steven Zaillian, and the two of them together, and Zaillian, of course, is... at that point, he had written, Schindler's List?
Schindler's List. I think Searching for Bobby Fischer was around that time. Yeah, I mean, he was great. But the story about Zaillian is really, really funny, I think.
Yeah, he said that the two of them together made a 10-page outline. They ate a lot of peanuts and smoked a lot of cigarettes. It took 6 weeks. Zaillian had enough at that point, so he bailed. So then at that point, David Koepp came on board, and Koepp and De Palma made the script together, developing it and getting it to where it was at that point. And when the movie got a green light, they actually asked De Palma to fire David Koepp and bring on, he says, this other writer who Cruise wanted. I don't think he says him specifically, but we know that's Robert Towne. Robert Towne, of course, who wrote Chinatown, is a legend at Shampoo.
Yeah.
So, I just thought that was interesting. And then he said that De Palma brought David Koepp back on the project after things with Towne weren't going well. But if you remember in the De Palma documentary, De Palma said that he actually had Towne and Koepp working at the same time on the movie during production. They were like in different hotel rooms or something like that, right?
Yeah. I think a lot of the consternation came about because the third act was something that was always in flux, and Towne kept pushing for a much more subdued version of just people taking off masks and that being the sort of climax, and Koepp wanted the train and all that. And thank God Koepp got his way, because that climax is just amazing, and it's so Mission Impossible, and it would have been a real bummer without it.
Yeah, and of course David Koepp has written so many huge blockbusters, Jurassic Park and Spider-Man and the Sam Raimi Spider-Man.
Yeah. On the jacket of David Koepp's book, it says, David Koepp's combined films have grossed $9 billion worldwide.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Well, so that's why, you listen to Koepp when he says he wants to do the train thing, which De Palma wanted to do as well. I just thought it was really cool to hear some clarification on that whole process, because we know the credits for the first movie are, I think it's story by Zaillian and Koepp, screenplay by Kep and Town. Is that right?
Yes, correct.
Yeah. So but now we got clarification on how that whole process went through. I just wanted to talk about that on the show because people kept tweeting it at us, and we just wanted to say we hear you, and it's pretty cool.
Usually the first writer on always gets some credit, so I think that's why Zalian has that credit, because he was the first one on. Because it sounds like they didn't use the Gloria Huck script at all, or else
it sounds like the basic bones of the story came out of that initial 6-week session of eating peanuts and smoking cigarettes between Depalma and Steven Zalian.
Which is how this podcast came about also, which is fun.
Another quick thing I wanted to say too, there are a couple people who didn't realize when we were talking about that Paula Patton costume test from the Michael Kaplan episode, a couple months back or whenever that was.
Yeah.
There's an actual photograph of Paula Patton wearing that costume.
Yes. We put it up online, didn't we?
Yeah, and I think some people thought that it was just a sketch or a drawing or something, but it's actually Paula Patton wearing the snow costume in Ghost Protocol. So if you haven't checked that out, go to our social media and check it out because it's really cool. We were blown away by that, and I think some people didn't even realize that that's what it was. So I wanted to clarify that before we kick things off here now with Joe Kraemer.
Yeah, well, how are we going to intro Joe?
Well, I mean, this is another one people have been asking us for a long time where we're going to get Joe Kraemer on the show, and we did. I mean, we've been stockpiling so many episodes lately. We did this months ago. This was like right before the pandemic, really before the lockdown happened. I think at this point they were telling us, stay away from people who traveled from out of the country. So we met him in the library and in Glendale and had a conversation with him. But I think we were all a little bit nervous when we got there. So this is our very last in-person interview, I think, after Michael Kaplan. And then ever since then we've been doing all these Zoom interviews, which have been wonderful. And we obviously had to do stuff for the 100th, so that's why this interview is taking a little while to come out, but we're very excited to share it with you all.
Yeah, I mean, he was great. He brought a lot of information and a lot of knowledge to the podcast, and we talk about music in general, movie music in general, and sort of what his approach to Rogue Nation was. So I'm very excited for people to listen to this. I thought we had a great conversation with him, and we loved the score, so it was a lot of fun.
Definitely, yeah, and I'm excited to we'll digest a little bit after the interview and talk about some stuff that I think is really fun. But for now, listen to, of course, speaking of music, Kevin Blumenfeld's illegal plot theme. Enjoy.
Well, thank you, Joe Kraemer, for finally coming on the show. We have wanted you here for so long, not specifically in the Glendale Public Library, but just on the show. So this is a huge thrill for us. So
I love it. It's our tax dollars at work. I love it.
Yeah. It's pretty nice, I got to say.
Civic recording studio.
Yeah. So usually we ask people who are part of this franchise, like, what was your relationship with Mission Impossible before scoring the movie? Did you watch the old show as a kid? Or
Yeah.
Okay, you did. Okay.
I'd seen the old show. I'd watched the 80s show when they were new. Mm-hmm. And then I'd seen the movies. As a fan of the old show, I was a little upset what they did with Jim Phelps' character, but,
Really?
beggars can't be choosers,
So you were a big fan of the show. Like you
I was enough of a fan to sort of be like, to feel like it was a little disrespectful maybe to the legacy of the show to turn him into a traitor.
Right.
What do I know?
Because there's also, season 1 was Dan Briggs, where you
right, exactly.
But do you prefer Jim Phelps, or you just like them both? Or
no, I think Phelps is the iconic one.
Yeah.
Briggs is sort of the Captain Pike of Mission Impossible.
And you watched.
I know
it
was my grandmother's favorite show, so that was a nice touch. I never thought I'd work on it, so that's why when I saw the first one, I never had any idea that I'd ever work on a Mission Impossible movie.
Yeah.
So I felt perfectly fine to have problems with the story, and what the hell is Cruise thinking? Now of course, it's all perfect. I kid.
So you watched? So did you watch it like when it?
Well, it used to be on
on Saturday nights or whenever it was.
The old ones, no, I was too little. I mean, I was born in 1971, so I saw it in syndication. Probably, I think maybe Nick at Night ran it at one point in the 80s, and so I saw it then, or TNT or something, and then of course the new one was probably on like NBC or CBS or something on Saturday nights, and I would watch that.
Right.
My mom watched a lot of soap operas, and I know one of the actors from one of her shows was on the 80s Mission Impossible.
Oh, wow.
He was like the master of disguise, I think,
Okay.
character.
We've only watched a little bit of the 80s show.
Right.
We haven't
A lot of people have fond memories of the 80s.
I have fond memories of it, although, I'm not sure if it's aged really well.
Yeah.
Some 80s television has aged pretty... It's crow's feet are showing. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Yeah.
Early Next Generation, there's some real 80s stuff in there that hasn't aged so well.
What was interesting about the 80s show was that they were all old scripts from the 60s show.
Were they really?
That
there was a
They'd never been made?
There was a
writer's
writer's strike.
Yeah.
Wow.
So they just recycled them and they filmed the whole thing with probably non-union crews in Australia.
That's
So-
what happened similarly with, speaking of Next Generation, the second season of Next Generation used a lot of scripts from an unproduced series that led to Star Trek the Motion Picture.
Oh, really?
And, like there's one where Ilea became Counselor Troy and
Right.
Kirk became Picard, They just repurposed the scripts for...
Oh, wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
I had no idea. You're a big Star Trek fan. So
I am a big Star Trek fan, and it's interesting how Mission and Star Trek are intertwined in a lot of ways.
Yes.
They were both Desilu. Lucille Ball had a lot to do with both of them getting made. They were made on the same lot at the same time, and the composers would go back and forth.
And
Yeah.
Nimoy.
And Nimoy,
Yeah.
of course, and they go
Yeah.
between the two shows.
Yeah.
And as a result, they had a similar sound to the scores and a similar composing technique to the scores. And it sort of surprises me how they both ended up at Paramount. And
What's the similar composing technique? I'm curious what that means.
the similar sized orchestras
Okay.
or bands or combos led to decisions that the composers made based on that.
Right.
So, there's the theme that Lalo Schifrin wrote for The Plot, which goes like bum,
Yeah,
bum,
we're obsessed with the plot
bum,
theme.
bum,
We'll-
be-dum, right?
We'll want to be talking to you about that in a bit.
Well,
yeah.
there's a theme in Star Trek that goes like bum 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 bum.
Oh, really?
Bum 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 bum.
So they have their own
And-
version of the plot.
Well, the guys were probably, I talked with Lalo a little bit after I did 5, and he was telling me that they all used to have. There was like a hallway at Universal, and they all had offices. So it was like Lalo, John Williams, Jerry Goldsmith, Bernard Herrmann, and I forget who the fifth one was. But
Holy cow.
And so they would just hear what each other was working on. If the grammar of that is right. They would hear what they were working on, and comment with each other about the work, and apparently Herman was always annoyed when people would write scores that were more aleatoric or modern and didn't have themes or music. Kids today, So there was this communal atmosphere, and I'm sure when he was doing Mission, it was similar situation because it was him, Fred Steiner, Gerald Fried, these guys. They were like journeyman composers,
Right.
and you didn't make a bundle up front on television even then. If the shows ran, you did pretty well with royalties and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I'm sure they were taking every opportunity they had to write episodic scores.
Wow.
Yeah, we've been slowly going through the episodes of the old show. There's just so many, and we've gotten so many great guests from the movies that we haven't had time to really get into the show too much.
Right.
But even just in the however many 8 or 10 episodes we've watched, it's amazing how varied the music is because the different composers brought very different approaches or styles.
And I'm very into the 80s synth version of the theme.
You are
too.
into
Yeah,
it?
I'm into it, yeah.
Lalo was a,
Yeah,
Lalo
that's
was a
great,
part of
yeah.
that. I mean, he did it with, was it Ron Jones? or
Ron
something?
Jones. I suspect. I don't know the details. My suspicion is that Lalo is credited for the material that he wrote for the '60s show. But that Ron was really doing.
Oh, interesting.
You
'Cause
know.
I think we have the tracks. We've gotten all the tracks
Right.
of all the different soundtracks, and it lists the two of them as composer on it, together.
Right. There's a lot of
for
cues.
a lot of tracks.
There's a lot
But
of
maybe it's
cues
just
in the
because
film
of-
that I did that we have to share credit because
Oh,
I
you
would
do?
quote
Okay.
his material.
Interesting.
But that's because he did write that material
Yeah,
and then
yeah.
I adapted it, and
But it's not usually reflected on iTunes. I have your score and it just says your name by yourself.
Gotcha.
Whereas that one, it's for the '80s
Yeah.
show. It says Lalo and Ron Jones. So I don't.
I don't know.
It's interesting.
I don't know. It may have something to do with the way things are labeled by different record labels. The
Yeah.
way
That's
things are
true.
credited.
yeah.
Maybe Lalo did do some of it too. But if it was synth based, Lalo's
He
always
just-
struck
yeah,
me of
he's-
more of a live player
Yeah.
thing.
yeah.
And Ron doesn't strike me as a guy who collaborates at that level.
Okay.
He did Star Trek: The Next Generation.
Wow, they're intertwined.
Again, the two series are intertwined. He did that with Dennis McCarthy, but what they would do is Ron would do one episode and Dennis would do the next, and then Ron would do the one after that. That way they each got 2 weeks to do an episode instead of one.
Oh, wow.
That's cool.
So they were both the composers on the show, but it was collaborative in the sense that they would talk to each other, but
They weren't really doing it
Ron
together.
would do episode 1, Dennis episode 2. And,
Yeah.
You know, so, but I don't know. I mean, I wasn't there, so it's possible that, Lalo and Ron were
Yeah.
sitting down together and writing cues.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing how music-driven the old show was.
Yeah,
Mission Impossible. I mean, without the music, it doesn't work. Like, there's so many long stretches of them pulling off some, heist of some sort, and it's just so driven by that amazing music, and that just carries it so far.
It was a different aesthetic in the 60s, obviously, in terms of what music does and how music was used.
Right. But from what I've read, it also was revolutionary. That show in particular was revolutionary in its use of music.
Interesting.
That's what I've read. At least I don't. Who knows if I read the wrong thing?
No,
but
I'm
that's what
sure.
I've
No,
heard,
I'm not. I don't.
that
I
it
don't
was
contest that. That's
Yeah.
interesting.
I guess
Probably
a lot of TV didn't do that, where it was like silent sequences with like really long passages of just music carrying it.
Right, and then like a show like The Sopranos, a modern show like The Sopranos, which didn't have, I don't think, a note of score in the entire series. If they used music, it was a song.
Right.
Oh, interesting.
So it's a whole spectrum of the way things are scored or the way shows use music.
Yeah.
Star Trek had a lot of music in it too, the original, and the way they got around it. And I don't know if Mission did this, but the way the Trek series got around some of the budgetary limitations was to reuse music. Say from the first 3 episodes, then episode 4 would be a score made from pieces from the first 3 episodes,
Right.
edited together.
Yeah. It seems like Mission would do that as well. Sometimes they'd pick up
believe it.
older pieces and stuff. And
Yeah.
But I was surprised at some of the episodes that would have like a whole new score. That it felt like even a different style than another episode.
Right.
Because it was a different composer.
Well, and you'll have that with again, because it was the same group of people. You'll have that with Trek, where the score to the Tribbles episode is like a comedy score,
Right.
but then the score to the one where Spock has to fight Kirk because he's
Yeah.
got like the Vulcan horn. He's got to fight.
Is that the one that Jim Carrey sings in Cable Guy?
Yeah. And that's almost like Stravinsky.
Right.
And then some of them are like almost like a Western.
Well, speaking of that, like, we love this approach that you took, that you wanted to use instruments that were only around in the 60s.
Right.
Where did that come from, you or McCory?
That came from me.
Okay, so where did that come from, though, that kind of aesthetic approach?
So for me, well, all right. So I'll give you a little history. Is that I had done Reacher with Cruise and McQuarrie, and Tom especially was a big fan of the retro sound. Now I never thought of it as retro. It's just the kind of sound I like in movies. I'm a big John Williams fan, a big Jerry Goldsmith fan, a big fan of David Shire, who had done a lot of movies in the 70s with Coppola and other Alan Pakula and So that's where my instincts take me anyway. So when McQuarrie was hired to do Mission by Tom, apparently Tom's first thing was, you want the job, and then his second one was, can we get Joe to do the score? Which was very gratifying when I heard that.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. And so they went to Vienna to start filming the opera sequence, and there was nobody on the production team whose sole job, whose only reason to be there was to deal with the music of the opera. They had storyboards, they had picture editor, they had crew, they had all these extras sitting in the pit holding musical instruments, and there was nobody there who knew what to tell them to do. And they realized, oh God, we need somebody on the set who their responsibility is to look after this opera sequence. And so I was called at that point, unbeknownst to me, Bad Robot, who produced the film, have a great relationship with the composer Michael Giacchino. And he had done Mission 3 and 4, and they were very excited about the possibility of Michael continuing on to do 5. Rightly so. I totally get that. McQuarrie and Tom were pushing for me, which, again, I'm totally grateful for. When this situation with the opera came up, I think probably there was a feeling that Michael wasn't going to want to take off 2 months from his Hollywood career to come to London and supervise the filming of this opera sequence. What they did was they filmed like 2 days at the Opera House, but they couldn't close it to shoot the whole sequence there. So they rebuilt the opera stage, the proscenium, the first 3 rows of seats, and the windows, or the box seats on the sides of the stage in London. And so it was at that point that the production team went to Bad Robot and said, look, can we have Joe come out and do this? And if he screws it up, we can can him and have Giacchino. And so that was sort of my trial by fire. All of this is to say that then I flew to London, went to a soundstage where they were filming a sequence that isn't actually in the movie anymore. And, they called cut, and Cruise came out from the car that they were shooting the scene in. And I was like, hey, man, how are you? And said hi, because I'd met him on Reacher. And, the first thing he says, dude, you're going to crush it, man. It's going to crush it. And I was like, not for nothing, Tom, but I better, because if I screw it up, my career's over. And then the second thing he said is, I want retro, man. And I want tons of percussion. Retro and percussion, man. So I had that in the back of my head. When I finished supervising the musical aspects of this opera sequence, and I was on the set every day for 6 weeks and helping them, I was sort of a go-between between the director, the script supervisor, the picture editor, and the actor playing the conductor and the musicians who were miming the opera. And so I was sort of keeping track of, okay, we're here on page 42. We're halfway between these 2 points that the script indicates in the opera, maybe the beginning of the third act and the caliph saying "Tocando," and the gunshot going off. Well, that would be about here in the music. The camera's pointed this way, so we need to make sure that the strings are playing this bar here, so that And I said, by the way, and I told the production team, I said, none of this really matters in the sense that you'll be able to move stuff around any way you want in the final edit, and chances are you're not going to be loyal to the linear progression of the opera if it slows the story down. You need to make sure the scene works and the story works, and then we'll fit the opera music around it. But we should do our best to make sure that we're starting off on the right foot. So when I finished that supervision, I went back to L.A., or I came back to L.A., I guess, since we're in L.A. now, and started working on a cue for the airplane sequence, which at that point was the opening of the movie. When I read the script, the opening scene was actually, and I don't usually read scripts, but because of this opera sequence, I felt obligated to know how it fit into the scale of the whole story. And the opening scene in the original screenplay was the record shop's scene, which is a throwback to the pilot episode where Dan Briggs walks into the record store.
Yep.
So,
we heard the airplane was like the second act break or something. Like, that's how far...
No, it was never in the script.
Oh, it was never in the script?
When I came out to L.A., they were having... it's an amazing stunt. Mm-hmm. And its inclusion in the film was propelled by what an amazing stunt it would be. And there was this pressure, I think everybody felt, to try to outdo the jump out of the Burj Khalifa. So this airplane stunt became that maybe showstopper.
Right.
The challenge was, how does it fit in the plot? And, the way these movies are made, oftentimes you have a release date and you work backwards from there. And, I hope I'm not talking out of turn, but, there were a lot of sequences where they were stunts. They knew they wanted a motorcycle chase. They knew they wanted an opera sequence. They knew they wanted a foot chase through London. They knew they wanted an underwater sequence. They didn't necessarily quite know how it was all going to fit together yet. Yeah. So they were sort of putting the plot together and moving things around, and certain aspects of things would be done digitally. Like if Tom needed to look a little more dirty or tussled up, they could do some of that digitally if they moved a sequence from before the bike chase to after it, stuff like that.
Right.
It's kind of like what they did in Blade Runner with Deckard, where he's got that scratch on his face and it comes and goes in the original version because they moved scenes around.
Right. But in the final cut, they're able to fix that.
And then they use computers. Well, nowadays, that's what they do. They use computers to fix it. And they almost don't do any blood anymore on set. Yeah. It's all digitally done now, so they can get a PG-13 if they need to, or an R. Anyway, so at one point, the airplane sequence was actually like a post-credit sequence about their next adventure. And they were talking about replacing Renner with Baldwin, since Baldwin was now in charge of, and because Renner had done all his stuff separate from everybody else. You could do that. Any option, any possibility was up for exploration during the editing of the film.
Wow.
But in any case, it ended up being the opening of the film after all. And it just worked best as an opening. And
Yeah.
the thing was, my feeling was always that a pet peeve of mine was always when you saw something really cool in a trailer, and then when it finally shows up in the film, it's somewhat trivial, and you sort of feel like you were sold something that you didn't get. Such is the case with the airplane sequence, that my feeling was when they showed it to an audience where it was a sort of throwaway joke sequence in the end credits, the audience felt a little bit ripped off because we've been waiting the whole movie for this amazing stunt, and we get it, but it doesn't matter.
So they actually tested it. They
tested
it to
not like to a public audience, but they showed it to
test
people.
screening, yeah.
Well, Cruise especially is a big believer in getting audience feedback.
Yeah.
For example, in Reacher, there were 2 versions of the ending: one where he had a kiss with Helen Barr, and one where he didn't. And Cruise pushed very much to make sure that they got the kiss in case, that he pushed very hard for it to be something that they got on the set. And then when he saw the cards, he was the first person to say, kiss has to go, man. The audience is not buying that. They don't need that to feel like the film is resolved.
Yeah.
And Cruise is very good about like covering his bases and making sure we've got one with it, one without it. I know that, I forget where I read it, but for example, in the new Star Wars movie, that kiss between Kylo Ren and Rey, between Adam Driver and Daisy Ridley, was in and out constantly. They just weren't sure if it was going to work or not, or if the audience would read too much into it or feel like it wasn't earned. And in the end, there were enough people, I think, that felt like that relationship could sustain that kind of gesture that they kept it in.
Right.
So I was writing this. It takes me so long to answer questions. I'm
No,
sorry.
we love it.
I was
It's
writing
wonderful.
this music for the airplane sequence, and I found myself using certain synth textures on top of my orchestration textures, my orchestral textures. So on top of the woodwinds and the strings and the brass, I had some synth elements, and they just weren't sitting right with me. And I realized at the time, while I was doing this, I was also reading a book about Desilu and the making of Star Trek, and there was a lot about the making of Mission in this sequence as well, in this book as well. And at the same time, I had sort of gotten a blessing from Tom and the director I said, I really don't want to go back and watch the first 4 Mission movies again. I'd seen them when they came out, but I don't want to go back and watch them because I don't want to copy what Danny and Zimmer and Giacchino did. However, the director said, well, that's great, because I don't really want to make a sequel to Ghost Protocol. I want to make the biggest episode of Mission Impossible anyone's seen. So I went back and started watching the first season again, and I got about 6 episodes in and thought, well, I've got enough of a flavor to start working.
Right.
And I saw how Lalo used the plot theme and how different writers would incorporate elements from the Mission Impossible theme. And as I was doing this demo for the airplane sequence, anytime I sort of stepped outside of that sound of the 60s, it started to feel wrong to me. Or maybe not wrong, but in conjunction with this was an interview I'd read once with Martin Campbell when he did Casino Royale, where he was saying, Austin Powers has kind of made it difficult to make Bond movies because they did such a great job skewering things, and he said, we're sort of having to reinvent the whole thing because of Austin Powers from a villain point of view, from a action sequence point of view, from a character point of view, from a music point of view, that the da 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 da, Clinton had done such a great job sort of goofing on the John Barry sound, and to a degree Michael had sort of turned it into a pastiche with The Incredibles.
Yeah.
So that when he was doing it on Mission, there was always a sort of tongue-in-cheek vibe to it that he brought to it, which the humor of that was nice. I wanted to sort of maybe be a little more, what's the word? More of an homage, less of a pastiche.
Okay.
More of a continuation and less of a sort of winking nod.
Right.
Not look back. You know what I mean? My template for sequel scoring has always been John Williams and the way he would take Darth Vader's theme and turn it around and make the little kid's theme for Phantom Menace, or the way he would take the Ark theme, and if you saw something that looked like the Ark in a sequel, you'd hear a little fragment of it.
Right.
Or, quoting things either directly or obliquely
Yeah.
in order to evoke in the audience that sense of familiar, but also something new.
Well, you have that theme that goes through the whole thing. It sort of hints at it and then comes out full force with Meet the IMF, which is sort of, I don't know if that's exactly what you're talking about, but it's like that kind of, it feels like Mission Impossible, but an evolution of it. And
Right.
It's like the IMF theme, or I don't know what.
I always think of it as Ethan Hunt's theme.
Okay, yeah.
Because the
And
Mission
it's like
Impossible theme is sort of a teen theme.
Yeah.
In my score for Rogue Nation, the plot theme is really sort of Benji's theme.
Oh, interesting.
In the sense that, I just always thought of it as sort of Benji's theme. Renner has a theme that is sort of the Mission Impossible theme. If you think of the Mission Impossible theme as like a question and then an answer, where the banana is the question.
Right.
Well, in the Renner theme, it's like da-na-na. Well, sorry, that's Hunt's theme. Da-na-na-na.
That's like, we'll just Meet the IMF.
And what that is I took the chords that are implied by Lalo's flute theme. I don't have perfect pitch, so those of you with perfect pitch who are listening can laugh at me. I took the chord sequence that melody implied and then wrote a different melody that could sit on top of it.
Right.
So that at the end, it happens both with Meet the IMF, and it also kind of happens when he takes the mask off.
Yes.
At the Blenheim, with the Prime Minister.
At the embassy or whatever
and,
that is.
Baldwin is like, Hunt.
Yeah.
So Renner had a theme that was like, what is it? I was just listening to the score on the way here to remind myself of some stories, and now all of the themes are jumping around in my head.
Well, Ilsa has a theme too, right? I mean, you adapted some of the
I took
opera,
the Nessun
right?
Dorma theme, which is the da da dee da 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 na,
Right.
na, and I both reharmonized it and then would sometimes keep the sort of contour of that melody, but change the actual notes. So like when she gets kicked out of the car and rolls across the cement in Vienna and then gets picked up by Solomon Lane's people, you hear it's the rhythm and the shape of the Nessun Dorma melody, but it's totally different notes.
Yeah.
So it's the familiar and the unfamiliar mixed together.
That's really cool.
Anyway, the Renner theme, it sort of has its own beginning, but then the end is the da-na-na, na-na-na, na-na-na, da-na-na.
Right.
And so that the Lalo's mission theme becomes the answer rather than the question.
Right.
So
That's cool.
Go find it on the soundtrack album. I can't remember how to
Well,
sing
then
it.
there's also a theme for, and I think the track is called Solomon Lane, so I assume it's the Solomon Lane theme, and it kind of has a little bit of if I'm not mistaken, sort of a Middle Eastern flavor to it, almost.
Sure. I mean, it was supposed to be. It's not necessarily. Yeah, it does have a slightly Middle Eastern flavor. What that came from more was this notion that he could sort of spin a tale. I started working on the film before they were done filming. Not only when I was scoring that airplane sequence, but I moved to England in February of 2015, and I was there for 6 months to write and record the score. I was working on reels 1, 2, and 3 while they were shooting reels 6 and 7.
So there was I assume no temp music then. It was just yours from the start?
Well, McQuarrie doesn't like temp music. He had this, we sort of stumbled upon this working method on The Way of the Gun because we had used some temp music in The Way of the Gun, and that ended up causing all sorts of headaches with the studio because they didn't like the temp, and they thought that the temp was, and there was some confusion about was the temp me or was the temp other film music. And I was, The Way of the Gun was my first sort of studio movie, so there was all sorts of political stress and tension because they didn't really care for parts of the temp, and they were thinking that they were going to have to replace me, not McQuarrie and Ken Kochen, the producer, but the studio, until the picture editor and the director sat down with the studio and said, no, this is Joe, this is temp. And they were like, well, we like all the Joe stuff. Why don't you tell us this? You know what I mean? So when we did Reacher, there was no temp, with the one exception being that because Cruise is a big believer in test screenings, you can't show a film to an audience without any music. It'll just die.
Right.
So what they would do is they would hire somebody, not me, they would hire somebody else and say, make a temp score that sounds like the score that Joe's working on.
Right.
And show that to the audience. So it's none of my music, but it's coming from a similar place.
Yeah.
They show that to the audience, and then that way you can see it with music, and they can give feedback on the film and, maybe the music, but nobody really cares because none of that music is me, and none of that music has anything to do with what I'm writing. I've already written, by the time we had the first test screening for Reacher, I'd already written the whole score from beginning to end and was in the process of making revisions for the director. So similarly with Rogue Nation, there was no temp in terms of editing the film. There was temp only for moments when they would show stuff to the to different audiences.
Right.
And in that process, I was turning stuff over, and it was being used in the temp at that point, as opposed to on Reacher where it wasn't.
When did you know that you got the job? After
For Mission?
Yeah, after you scored the
No,
airplane?
I knew. I mean, at the risk of sounding a little bit arrogant, I
Right.
mean, I had been training my whole life for an opportunity like
Right.
Rogue Nation. And I knew I was going to be able to do whatever needed to be done for that opera sequence. I'd worked on musicals. I had done conducting. I directed films as a student. I knew enough about the whole process that I was confident they weren't going to fire me. I was going to get everything done that needed to be done. And at that point, that being said, I went to the premiere of Way of the Gun half expecting that to have none of my music in it. You know what I mean? At the time, there was a certain executive at Paramount Pictures who hated the Mission Impossible theme and had been trying really hard to get it taken out of the movies, especially the fourth one. And
What?
And you can see in the trailer campaigns that came out for Mission 5, the one I worked on, that the Mission theme is kind of buried at the end and not really used. I mean, I recorded a whole score for the Mission trailer campaign that was almost entirely unused because a certain executive just didn't want it anywhere near the movies.
Wow.
There's a lot about making movies in Hollywood and a lot about franchise films that would surprise fans because a lot of times the people making these movies don't really like the franchise and they're trying to turn it into something else.
Yeah.
Conversely, like John Williams, I never knew this, but I found out from an NPR interview I did. They told me that apparently Depalma wanted Williams to do the first one, but Williams would only do it if he could write his own theme. He didn't want to be sort of shoehorned in, I guess. For whatever reason, I can't begin to guess. He didn't want to use Lalo's theme. And, and they were like, well, thanks very much. But no, if you don't want to use the theme, we'll go with somebody who would like to use the theme.
I've never heard that.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Silvestri got on, and then they booted Silvestri.
Yeah. I don't know anything about that.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Williams' score for The Fury is one of my favorites. It's
yeah.
Overlooked John Williams masterpiece.
It's a great score.
Yeah. And we're back. Thoughts, Charles? Digressions?
Well, he told us off the air afterwards because he remembered that I'd asked him a question about the Solomon Lane theme and how it kind of had a Middle Eastern flair. He said that that actually he wanted to elaborate on that answer a little bit more. He said that there was this element to the plot that was toned down. At one point, Solomon Lane was trying to seduce Ethan to the syndicate. That was a part of the story. And the Middle Eastern flair kind of gave it sort of this snake charmer vibe, is what he said. And that
interesting.
There were these speeches in the movie that were cut out. There were these speeches of Solomon Lane trying to seduce Ethan to the syndicate. And I guess that's where that sound came from in the score. And I think, ultimately that side of the story got abandoned. I thought that was really interesting to hear.
Yeah, I don't think we've ever heard that before, and I clearly don't remember it from our off-air conversation, so I'm glad that
Good thing I wrote it down.
Yeah, I'm glad you've logged it in the official narrative of Rogue Nation.
Yeah. I mean, I thought it was really cool. He's obviously a scholar of film music. It was cool to hear him talk about how the music was similar on the old Mission and old Star Trek TV shows, to the point where even Star Trek has their own version of the plot theme. And I thought it was fascinating that Lalo Schifrin, John Williams, Bernard Herrmann, Jerry Goldsmith, these legends all had offices next to each other. And they'd pop in and say hi to each other while they're all working on these scores. It's unbelievable to me.
Yeah. We've talked on the show before about how we worship everything Jerry Goldsmith has ever done. So
yes,
it's always good to hear. It's always good to hear a good Goldsmith story, I think.
I know. I feel like we've talked about this before. I don't know if we've talked about it on the show, but you and I talking about who I think, to me, in my eyes, Jerry Goldsmith is the greatest composer who ever was, because he has arguably the best score from for a movie in each genre. You could name any genre, and Jerry Goldsmith has done it and has done something incredible in it that you could argue is the best score of that genre. So that's my argument for why I think Jerry Goldsmith's the greatest of all time.
Yeah, I mean, he's the greatest. There's no argument there from me. I don't have a pitch for that. I just think he's the best, and every movie is elevated by Jerry Goldsmith music, and movies that he walked away from, I think, suffer because of it. So he's just the best.
There was also a kind of an interesting tidbit that he said that there was an expectation from Bad Robot that Michael Giacchino could have returned for Rogue Nation, that he would have done 3 in a row, and that Kraemer was supervising the opera sequence, and if he screwed up, they would have just brought in Giacchino again.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely a possibility. I mean, they've worked with him so many times on so many projects.
Yeah.
TV, everything. So he could have come back, but I mean, I think that Kramer's music and how different it is helps differentiate it from Ghost Protocol, even though McQuarrie has said on multiple times that he was kind of, drifting behind Ghost Protocol and trying to sort of replicate that feeling. I feel like the movie is actually very different, and part of that is Kramer's score.
Yeah, that was something that even Kraemer said in this part of the interview. I think he said that McQuarrie told him he didn't want to make a sequel to Ghost Protocol. He wanted to make the biggest episode of the TV show ever, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah, that's really cool. McQuarrie obviously has a deep love for the show, too, so that doesn't surprise me completely.
Also, we heard, this is crazy, but at the time that there was a Paramount executive who wanted to remove the Mission Impossible theme from the movies, especially Ghost Protocol, which I'm just going to assume this is the same person who was trying to get Tom Cruise off of this franchise, because this person I've got beef with.
Yeah, I wonder who it was. I mean, there always seemed to be a rotating cast of characters at Paramount. So I wonder whose decision that was. And yeah, I mean, it seems like Ghost Protocol was maybe the most fraught production of all, just in terms of that instability of what was going to happen going forward. I think they've gotten into a groove, and I think if somebody was installed tomorrow at the top of Paramount, they would still say, yes, we need to make 7 and 8. But, there were a lot of question marks back then, but removing the theme is just insanity.
Yeah. I can't.
And I love that. And I think that Bird probably doubled down and said, okay, we're going to make the longest credit sequence ever because of that.
That's so true. I love that.
It seems like a very Brad Bird thing to do.
Oh, you don't want the theme? We're gonna hold it for 4 minutes during the opening credits. That's amazing. Another thing too that we'd never heard, that Depalma actually originally wanted John Williams to do the first movie. And John Williams wanted to write his own theme and wasn't going to use the Mission Impossible theme, so they said no thank you. Which, I love John Williams, and it would have been cool to see him reunite with Depalma after The Fury. But
yeah,
you can't do Mission Impossible without the Mission Impossible theme.
Yeah, seems really weird. But I would love to have seen them. I've always wanted to see them, collaborate again after The Fury, because I love that score and I love that movie. But yeah, sorry, Danny Elfman just knocked it out of the park. Sorry, Billy. That's what I call John Williams.
Johnny Bills.
Johnny Bills.
I guess there's a lot more to this interview. It gets really interesting next week. Definitely you want to come back. He tells us all about Christopher McQuarrie's cameos and Usual Suspects, Jack Reacher, Rogue Nation. McQuarrie, I think, is always plays coy on Twitter about where his cameos are in movies. So you're going to hear all about all those and a lot more. We get very interesting stuff next week about the process of doing a score like this.
And obviously, until then, if you could do us a favor, and if you want to sign up for the Patreon, it's patreon.com/LightTheFuse. If you want to buy something from our TeePublic store, we've got a bunch of great t-shirts, hats, masks, all that stuff there. And also, if you could just tell a friend, tell 2 friends, they'll tell 2 friends. You know how it goes. That would be huge for us. And we have people to thank this week, don't we, Charles?
Yes, we do. Yeah, a special thank you to Dustin Catalan. And we've got some new sponsors that we got to mention as well.
Yeah, actually, Charles, this episode is brought to you by Jeremy Dillon, John B., and Real Estate Interests LLC. commercial real estate for growing companies. So thank you to all of you for keeping this show on the air.
Yes.
Because that's really what it is. You guys are keeping this afloat.
Yes, and please check out our Patreon at patreon.com/lightthefuse. We are about to record a fun episode about Die Hard with a Vengeance while Drew makes a sandwich. So you will appreciate that, I think.
Yeah, you don't want to miss that. You do not want to miss that. And we will be back next week with Joe Kraemer, Part 2.
Thanks again for listening, everyone. And before we go, another mission, should you choose to accept it. Please rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. And remember that you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at LightTheFusePod and email us questions or comments at lightthefusepodcasts@gmail.com. This message will self-destruct in 5 seconds.